this subcommittee on the police use of force policy for the city of St. Louis will be called to order. Will the clerk please read the roll?
Alderman Vaquero,
Present.
Alderman Carter, Alderwoman Spencer, Alderwoman Green,
Present.
Chairman French.
Present.
We have 3 present and we have a quorum.
All right. We have with us again Professor Klinger. Is it Dr. Klinger?
Yeah.
Dr. Klinger.
Doesn't matter. It's 6 1, half a dozen of another.
Okay. Who has returned, and this time you brought a few other things with you. What have you brought?
I printed out a copy of the use of force document that was on the website. The link was provided for me. And then also I provided testimony to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights about the general issue of police use of force last year. And it struck me that it might be useful to provide the subcommittee with my written testimony regarding that. So I produced that, and I'll also be sending your aide a electronic copy.
Okay. The clerk.
Clerk, I'm sorry.
Yeah. So do you mind if we put this available on our website as we?
Go right ahead, yeah.
All documents?
It's a public document.
Okay. After having a chance to review the current use of force policy, let's just continue with the conversation we started last week.
Sure.
Given your 2 previous studies over the St. Louis use of force, now that you've seen the current use of force policy, do you have any thoughts on it? Do you think some of your previous recommendations were taken into consideration, or?
I think that what I'd like to start out with is the 2 big recommendations that I had about how to change the way that the police department deals with the aftermath of shootings as a mechanism to improve situations where officers have to make choices about A, how to approach potentially violent situations, and then B, what level of force to use. I think that those 2 things were definitely listened to after the second report in 2 ways. Number one is the establishment of the Force Investigation Unit, and we had discussed that briefly last time. And looking at the documentation and also having some discussions with the commander of the unit, Roger Engelhardt, it's apparent that the police department has taken very seriously the recommendation that they beef up, strengthen, improve the investigation of use of deadly force. And I know that they stood up that unit sometime in 2014, and it has been the practice to get the best training that is available out there in terms of how to investigate officer-involved shootings. I know that Lieutenant Engelhardt has been to several training sessions around the country. I don't know exactly the sessions that he has attended, but I know some of them. And so he's getting the appropriate training and passing that information on. And with that enhanced ability to investigate officer-involved shootings, the police department is now putting that to work to have the Force Investigative Unit investigate all officer-involved shootings where individuals are struck by police gunfire. And I think that's vitally important. That's vitally important because having a sound investigation means that you have a sound understanding of what happened. We will never know exactly what happened because, for example, we talk about video. Video only takes a 2-dimensional representation from one angle. So we might have multiple videos, in-car video, body camera video, citizen video, might have some audio. So we'll never know everything, but we get a much better approximation of what happened when we have sound investigative practices. And so I think that is something that the police department took seriously and has done a stand-up job on. One of the questions, I can't remember if it was you or one of the other subcommittee members asked me last time, was where does St. Louis stand vis-a-vis other entities, other agencies, and having a force investigation unit that is devoted to officer-involved shootings is the leading edge. And it is what I believe every major law enforcement entity should have on hand. So my hat is off to the police department for that. The second thing, and arguably more important thing, is the tactical review. I had argued in both of my reports that the only way that an organization learns, and in this case, police department obviously, about the issue of the use of deadly force, is to have a review of everything that went into that moment. And what I mean by that is training of the officers, the communications that were broadcast back and forth between the dispatch and the police officers, maybe even communication between the citizen caller and the dispatch, and making sure that officers get all of that information. We had briefly discussed the Tamir Rice situation in Cleveland, where the officers didn't have all the information. It's my understanding that we touched on that very briefly last time. I hope my recollection is correct. At any rate, so building up from what information officers have to where they decide to deploy, which is an issue we spoke about regarding the shooting of the gentleman here in St. Louis with the knife. Where does an officer stand? How do he and his partner, or she and her partners, deploy? Verbal commands, so on and so forth. So having a tactical review team having a tactical review is vital. And what the police department has done, according to my review of the document you provided, is they have stood up a tactical review team that looks at, in fine-grained detail, all of the steps that went into the situation that resulted in an officer-involved shooting. So they are building from the ground up communications, tactics, decisions, and then they can cycle that information back into training, which is vital. So my hat is off to the police department for those two things.
Okay. Do we have any questions from committee members?
No, I was gonna add, something I would think anybody in the committee, if they'd let us do it, a lot of times, and again, I have a different perspective, obviously, because my daughter's a supervisor up at 911, but a lot of times, if there's a gunshot, it isn't like one phone call and the person's calm. Generally, it's like the phone's lit up. In fact, to the point that even some calls can't get through. And then you got the officer who might be yelling, shots fired, shots fired. And it's really hard for them to sit down and go, well, maybe the guy, But I think if everybody go up and actually listen to some of these tapes, the ones I guess they'll let us listen to, I think what you find out is it's a lot of people yelling fire, and a lot of trying to get the information. Again, they have, 911 isn't the person that dispatches. They're like an evaluator. So a call comes into 911. Well, if there's a shooting, believe me, it's even a car accident. There's generally multiple calls that'll come in, about the same thing. And so you got multiple trying to send it to the dispatcher that makes sense of it. And again, the dispatcher is also in contact with the police officer, who's also, somewhat panicked. But I would think at some point, if we can listen to tapes, I also really feel that we need to go over and go into their scenario stuff. It's just an opinion, but, and again, I have a different perspective only because of my kids, But I do want to add that, because when we were talking last time about 911, it isn't, again, it isn't, people don't call that, Now, it's different if they're calling, and it's a single person that's calling about someone in their house that's causing trouble or distress. I don't know, what they say, but I'm saying in case of like gunshots or someone with a knife or something like that, there are generally multiple calls coming in at one time. And it might do us some good to listen to some of these tapes, if we can listen to them. I don't know if we can, if it's some sort of ongoing investigation where we cannot, but I think if you see all the, the stuff coming in, sometimes it might be hard to just come up with any one answer when you got a whole bunch of people calling to tell you different things. They have to go through it. Like on New Year's, even though they assume that the fireworks are not shots fired, people call shots fired, and they probably dispatch, I don't know, it's gotta be a bunch of shots fired, even though they can assume it's fireworks, but they still have to treat it like, they can't call in and go, well, it's shots fired, but most likely it's fireworks. They have to send it over as shots fired, or gunshots, or however they send it. But I just think if we get the time, it'd be really worthwhile to sit in. or listening to some of the tapes, because everything's taped. And that's, it's just an opinion, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Alderwoman Green, you have any questions?
Not right now.
Professor, or Dr. Klinger, the document you just gave us, the written testimony, where was this given? This was at the, to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights?
U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, right. They had several hearings around the country, and I was invited to provide testimony a little bit less than a year ago in New York City.
Okay. So just going through a few of these points. Can you tell us what the high reliability theory is?
Right. High reliability theory is a notion in organizational sociology that there are ways to organize human endeavors dealing with high-risk situations that reduce the likelihood of negative or bad outcomes. And so what high reliability theory talks about is the mechanisms that can be put in place by an organization to structure itself and to operate in a fashion that will produce fewer negative outcomes. And so what I did here is I argued that an officer-involved shooting, whether an officer is injured or an officer is not injured, whether a suspect is injured or not injured, these are negative outcomes in the sense that these are things that we don't want. We don't want police officers to be injured. We don't want police officers to shoot people. We understand, however, that due to the nature of the task that officers are called upon, that there will be times and places where officers are injured, and there will be times and places where officers need to use deadly force to protect themselves or third parties. But I argued that if we want to reduce officer-involved shootings, one mechanism would be to institute the framework of a high reliability organization that would produce what we call a safety culture that would then arguably lead to a reduction in both officer injury and suspect or citizen injury. And that ties in with one of the things that I mentioned when I was first speaking about the coupling of a force investigation unit and a tactical review. By having a sound understanding of what happened in a given incident where officers did discharge their firearms, and then reviewing the incident to try to identify points for improvement, the St. Louis Police Department is operating with some of the aspects that the high reliability theory says an organization should operate in order to produce a high reliability organization. That is one that has fewer missteps, fewer negative outcomes.
By that measure, how would you rate the St. Louis Police Department?
Vast improvement from when I first started looking at the operational aspects of the police department with my first review. I think if you read my my first report, I was quite frankly stunned at the lack of detail in the after-action investigations and then after-action reviews. There was no tactical review. The after-action investigations were often shoddy, but by stepping up or standing up the force investigative unit, force investigation unit, and developing the tactical review board, St. Louis Police Department has taken leaps and bounds towards what it should look like. Now, what I don't know is I don't know how the tactical review actually operates. I don't know if they have the right people with the right training, with the right tactical acumen to make the reviews as thoroughgoing and as beneficial as they could, and that would take some research to perhaps even roll out with the FIU, roll out with the Tactical Review Board and see how they actually operate. But the structure at least is there.
What about the culture?
Okay. When we talk about culture, and that's a big aspect of this notion of a high reliability organization, you have to have a culture that understands that you have to take a critical eye to all of your operations, and you have to create a culture that includes the attention to detail about what went right and what went wrong, so you can take from incidents and review them appropriately. And what that takes is a culture where officers and command staff up and down the chain don't look at situations with an eye to discipline and to punish as much as to learn and improve. And that would be one of the aspects of this notion of safety culture. A learning culture, a culture that is constantly focused on how can we improve. And so these are just two, I'm trying to be very brief, of the things that a culture, an organization needs to develop in its culture so that it can improve, so that it can learn. And this is both simple and difficult. It's simple because the literature on high reliability organizations and safety culture has identified what needs to be there, but shifting a culture so that it focuses on learning, shifting a culture so that it's okay to report when something has gone sideways, is not as good as it could be, is difficult. You know, police organizations, the paramilitary aspect of police organizations cuts both ways. You need to have a paramilitary structure in order for there to be the very tight chain of command that's necessary for discipline that needs to happen in law enforcement. When I mean discipline, I mean doing the right thing on the ground, not discipline in terms of punishment. You need to have that. But the flip side of that is paramilitary organizations tend to focus on errors or missteps as bad actions as opposed to opportunities to learn. And so creating a learning culture in a law enforcement organization is challenging.
What about the aspect of culture that is this often referred to as this blue wall of silence, where other officers, even if they didn't participate in the act,
Right.
as part of culture, cover up for it?
If that is something that's going on, if there are police officers that are doing the wrong thing, other officers are aware of that and not reporting it, then that is wrong and that is bad. Number one, it is improper because your general orders in every police organization I'm aware of say that if you're aware of misconduct, that it should be reported. And the other thing is that if one is aware of something and doesn't bring it to the fore, there's no opportunity to learn from it. So for two reasons, a culture of silence, for lack of a better term, is unsound, and it is something that should be rooted out. And not necessarily from the perspective of we're going to discipline, but rather from the perspective of can we learn. And one of the things that the safety culture talks about within this notion of high reliability organization is you have to develop what we call a reporting culture, a culture where people are trained to, are expected to, and indeed are rewarded for reporting when something is out of sorts. And a classic example in the literature is aircraft carrier operations. And without getting into the details, aircraft carriers are among the most dangerous places that anyone can ever work, on the flight deck. Just imagine jets taking off and landing, jet fuel, bullets, bombs, so on and so forth. But the U.S. Navy has figured out how to run aircraft carriers with very, very low rates of mistakes and very, very high levels of reliability. And one of the things that they do is they demand that if something goes wrong, you report it, and if your mistake was not from a maligned heart, but rather you simply overlooked something, or you made a mistake with the best of intentions, you will not be disciplined. And an example in the literature is a young mechanic who is working on fixing something on the flight deck, and he's got 20 tools. I can't remember the exact number, but he's got 20 tools. He does his fix, but when he goes to put all the tools back, he only has 19. Something is wrong. You cannot have a tool, a wrench, a pair of pliers, whatever, on the flight deck, because it can get sucked up into an engine and blow up the plane, and actually you could actually lead to the entire aircraft carrier being compromised. So he shuts the flight line down. He makes the announcement. He shuts the flight line down, and in the end, they find the piece. And what they do is they hold a ceremony and they reward the kid for reporting. So figuring out a way in law enforcement to get police officers to report the problems that they observed, that they faced, that they realized they committed, is something that's necessary in order to develop a safety culture, in order to have a high reliability police organization. But this requires a shift in the way the police department operates from a modality of punishing to a modality of learning.
Any other questions? Alderman Picaro? Alderman Green? Alderman Carter?
No.
Alderman Spencer?
So, Dr., well, I was going to ask you, you mentioned earlier that the St. Louis the policy here is a vast improvement from when you first started taking a look at this. Can you remind us, I know we talked about this last week, but can you remind us when you first started taking a look at this, rough year?
Probably about a decade ago would have been the first. Let me see what's the date on my first report. The date of the first report is '09, so I probably started looking in 8 years ago, basically, 7, 8 years ago, so, okay.
And so, Mr. Chairman, I have to sort of admit that I didn't take a close look at the use of force policy as posted on our subcommittee website, and I was taking a look at that now as we sit here, and I wondered if it might be useful. Dr. Klinger, did you look through? Presumably you looked through our current use of
Right.
force policy, and I apologize for coming in a little bit late here. Did we go through maybe some recommendations from your perspective on the policy itself, or would we find that to be a useful part of this?
What we did ask was, he mentioned he had not seen the current policy at the last meeting.
Sure.
He had had a chance to review. What we did ask was if he felt that any of the previous observations he made in his 2 previous reports had been taken into account and updated. He did speak of the Force Investigative Unit and the Tactical Review, but so you can try for deeper.
Right.
Okay, so we could talk about those two. Did you want to speak specifically on what, from your perspective, the use of the current use of force policy is missing, or things, aspects of it that we as a body should be looking to kind of push for change on?
There are some points that at first might sound to be nitpicky, but are actually quite important in terms of what I was talking about regarding how to have an organization that has clear lines of communication and clear lines of responsibility. And so when we look at the actual use of force policy, this would be special order dated September 9, 2014, order number section 1 of SO 1-01, which is the philosophy on use of force and periodic review of policy. This is good in terms of.
Sorry
sorry.
to stop you
Yeah.
right there. So in the, we have a few documents here. I was trying to figure out, I know there's quite a few. Is the policy sort of broken out into several documents that we could maybe take a look at with Dr. Klinger?
So those are, I'm not sure exactly what document he's looking at.
This is printed off right off of the website, sir.
Was it a collection of all the documents?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I see. So there's like 10 or 12, it looks like, maybe use of force documents that are provided from the police department.
Would you like to get a copy of specifically what he's looking at? We can make copies.
Do you think it would be helpful for us to look at it with you? I don't want to overstep what the most useful use are.
I honestly don't know, because I marked things up with just, a little comment here, a little comment there. As I indicated, some might be nitpicky.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it is information that I had already addressed in my reports. So it's up to you in terms of how you'd like to proceed.
I'd like to defer to the chairman here. I would find it useful to go through the actual use of force policy document. I think that Dr. Klinger brings up a point that we should also kind of go down, which is, you know, a policy is only gonna be as good as how we're employing people to, you know, review things, et cetera, and, you know, that qualitative aspect is something that we might not be able to address today in this meeting, but the actual policy itself is something we could.
Yeah, so we did that in hearing number 1, where they gave us all the documents. I think that was given to everybody. We also put it on the website. But for the sake of this conversation, I think it would be helpful for us to be looking at the same document. So if you want to take a 5-10 minute break and make copies for everybody.
I think we could probably just do it in a couple minutes. I'll run it over and see if one of the secretaries wouldn't mind.
Sure.
Do you mind if we do that? I
Not
think
at
we
all.
should just take a couple minutes.
So let's.
Now, the only thing I have to
Okay.
tell you is, I've got a hard time that I need to get out of here today, a
Okay.
little bit after 10.
Okay.
And so I have no
Yeah.
problem coming back another time if it would be more fruitful.
We got
Well, I
10
think-
o'clock. We got 10 o'clock.
Yeah,
Well,
we
we
do.
can-
We have to get her in a few minutes.
We have 10
So let's
o'clock.
take a 5-minute recess, and while those copies are being made. And then we'll come back for another 15 or so question. All right, our committee is now back from recess. Copies are still coming. But in the meantime, Alderwoman Spencer, would you like to continue some questions?
Sure, Dr. Klinger, on the break, we were talking about the difference between the, you know, kind of your the overview of policy,
Right.
use of force policy itself. Could you kind of rewind just a second and explain that?
Give me a little bit more guidance, I'm sorry, ma'am.
So you were saying, when you're, as we come back from the break to look at your review of our use of force policy,
Right.
you were kind of describing, or we were kind of deciding or discussing about going into the very small policy or the overall policy. Could you kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, if you think about a use of force policy, from my perspective, you want to have a policy that provides guidance for officers on the street. And so that might be the use of force policy that focuses on the use of deadly force and the use of less lethal force that says, here are the circumstances under which you are permitted to use force. Here are the circumstances under which you are permitted to use deadly force. Here are the restrictions on your use of deadly force, so on and so forth. The rest of the policy would deal with matters such as, after a shooting occurs, after a use of deadly force occurs, which is typically going to be shooting, here is what we want to happen administratively.
I see.
That's what the FIU statement's about. That's what the tactical review is about, so on and so forth.
So I think both of those, you know, reviewing, you know, your thoughts on both aspects would
Right.
be helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the initial point that I was making in response to the chairperson's comment was that leaps and bounds of improvement in terms of the after-action aspects of the policy. And with my assumption that the policies are actually being followed, the organization has moved forward remarkably in terms of being able to improve the state of affairs regarding the investigation and review of officer-involved shootings. Regarding the more narrow statements, I marked up the policy, which I'm going to call, it's dated July 15, 2009, order number section 2 of SO 1-01, which starts on page 2-1 of Roman numeral 2-1 of the document that you now have. There are some concerns that I have regarding definitions, for example. So you'll see that I put a border around deadly force regarding impact weapons. Don't want to get into a long, drawn-out discussion about this, but realistically, a blow to the head, in my opinion, blow to the neck. I don't know what an internal organ, how do you strike an internal organ unless you cut somebody open? I don't mean to be facetious, but I think that there should be some review of this because realistically, there's a huge difference between striking someone in one of these places and shooting someone. I understand the history. It could go into the background of why a lot of agencies want to talk this way. I happen to disagree with it. Then we go to point 2. You'll see that I've got an asterisk next to probable cause. the facts and circumstances which lead a reasonable person to believe that a crime has been committed or is being committed by a particular person. That's a correct statement, but then if we go 2 pages later, excuse me, 1 page later, on 2C, talking about when officers are permitted to use deadly force to stop the flight of a fleeing suspect, something we talked about briefly yesterday. C, the officer has probable cause to believe that the person poses a significant threat to human life should escape occur. Well, if you look at the definition of probable cause on definitions 2 and its usage there, those are, they don't line up.
So we're on page 2-1, and then where are we?
Page 2.1 and then 2.2 of SO 1-01. So if we look under definitions A on the first page of that document, probable cause is defined in the classic way of an individual having knowledge that a crime has occurred, but then the officer has probable cause to believe the person poses a significant threat to human life should escape occur. And I pointed this out in my reports that the use of that language doesn't make sense and it hasn't been cleared up. And some people might think that's nitpicking, but remember, the purpose of a general order, an operational order, a policy statement of this ilk is to provide clear-cut guidance to the line officers. And if a line officer is looking at this policy and he or she says, well, wait a second, probable cause has to do with knowledge about crime, now they're saying probable cause to believe a significant threat, that's complicated. Now, I understand historically where this language comes from in 2C because of Tennessee versus Garner, and once again, I don't want to get into the weeds on it, but it strikes me that that should be cleaned up. And there are other small matters that I argued should be cleaned up for 2 reasons. Number one, for guidance of officers on the street, and that's my primary concern, is always how do we tell officers, and in this case, obviously St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department officers, how do we give them clear-cut guidance so that they know when they are permitted to use deadly force and when they are not? Period, paragraph. The second thing is when it comes to reviewing. So for example, on C, restrictions, you'll see that I underlined possible and said practical, because I can foresee, and I in fact have seen things like this, of this ilk, because I testify in court, I've mentioned in use of force cases sometimes, the difference between possible and practical. So let's look at that. Identification as officer and verbal warning. Before shooting at a suspect, the officer will identify himself, herself as an officer and state his or her intent to shoot whenever possible. I would argue that that should be changed to practical. Why? Because in a review, we might say, of course it was possible for an officer to give a verbal challenge, but it might not have been practical. And let me give, for example, a situation where a command decision is made for a sniper to shoot someone who is in the process of threatening to kill a hostage. It's possible to call the guy up on the telephone and say, hey, look, if you don't let the hostage go, we're going to shoot you in the head. But what we know is there might be a very narrow window for that shot to be taken, so the issue is one of practicality. And once again, we could go into all sorts of examples, but I don't want police officers in the moment to be thinking, is it possible that I give a warning and be thinking about giving a verbal warning and then a citizen is killed right in front of them as they're trying to figure out whether it's possible for them to warn. And I don't want a review either here at the Aldermanic level or in a use of force review board or in a court to say, well, it was possible and therefore you violated the policy. Does that make sense? So there are some things that you will see in my markup that are matters that I think should be cleaned up. I've stated it in my reports, and so that's my argument. Warning shots, for example. Warning shots are prohibited. I don't understand why. I think that warning shots generally are a really bad idea. But if you absolutely prohibit warning shots, what you're doing is you're creating a situation where there may be an opportunity for an officer to avoid using deadly force by using a warning shot. But because you prohibit he or she from using a warning shot, the next thing the officer must do to protect innocent life is shoot somebody. And I would rather reserve, hang on a second, sir. I would rather reserve officers the right to use a warning shot with very strict training prescriptions than to say you could never use it. I'm sorry, sir.
Just a question, and I'm just thinking of even hunting.
Mhm.
If you fire a warning shot, whether you fire it in the air, the ground, to the sides,
Mhm.
that bullet's gonna go a long way.
Absolutely.
That's why they don't want you on New Year's Eve shooting guns in
Absolutely.
the air. So I would wonder if I shot a warning shot, if I shot it in the air and it goes a half a block before it hits somebody, goes, I mean, you see it in a lot of the drive-by stuff where they're just
Right.
shooting randomly out to nowhere.
Right. No. Please don't misconstrue that I'm saying that officers should shoot in the air to warn people as a general process. But let me suggest something that has happened. An officer is on one side of a 12-foot chain link fence. A suspect is in the process of stabbing an individual or kicking an individual who's down on the ground on the other side of the chain link fence. Deadly force would be warranted. But the officer says, you know what? I want to give this person an opportunity to not be shot. And let's say, for sake of argument, the officer is in an alley and he or she knows for sure that the only thing off to the right is a pile of I'm thinking junk, whatever, but a pile of soil that has just been excavated by MoDOT or somebody.
Yeah.
So we know that that's okay to shoot into because you know what's behind your firing line in most police academies is a berm. So there's a berm. The officer says, you know what? Stop or I'll shoot. The guy looks up and the officer has eye contact with the individual. The individual is about to draw his foot back. And the officer says, stop or I'll shoot. Boom, fires around into the berm. The guy goes, holy mackerel, this officer's serious. Steps away from that potentially fatal assault. I've avoided a shooting, right? But the way this document is written, it says it's prohibited. Now, the preface says the department recognizes that in exceptional circumstances, violations of the following restrictions may be justified by necessity. There's wiggle room there. I think that you could probably make an argument as a police officer here in St. Louis that it was necessary for me to fire a warning shot, but why not have a policy statement that says something to the effect of warning shots are generally prohibited as opposed to absolutely prohibited. Then you don't have this lawyerly or Talmudic argument about whether it was a necessity or not to violate the policy. I don't want a policy statement that tells me it's okay to violate it sometimes. And this is an issue that I brought up in my previous report. Also, shooting at moving vehicles or suspects in vehicles. An officer will not discharge a firearm at or from a moving vehicle nor at a suspect in a moving vehicle. I disagree with that. About 4,000 people on average are killed every year with pedestrian versus motor vehicle accidents. So we know that motor vehicles are instruments of deadly force. What we want to do in our training is train officers not to place themselves in jeopardy and then shoot their way out of it. But there are situations in the cases that I reviewed where clearly an officer needed to use deadly force to protect an innocent citizen. And one was a situation where one of your jump out teams went to stop a guy in a car. The guy took off and ran over a bicyclist and was on top of the bicyclist backing up, going forward to try to do a J-turn to get out of the way. The officer shot and rightly protected that innocent citizen's life. But if you follow the letter of the law, they shouldn't have done that. So I think that shifting the language to once again give officers clearer guidance about when they can and cannot use deadly force would be wise.
And where is that about the car?
Restrictions, point 3, so C, restrictions, point 3, on page Roman numeral 2-2. And, you know, we could spend literally hours going over line by line these concerns I have, but I wanted to bring those two out. Once again, as examples of, we want to control the use of deadly force. We don't want officers to shoot unless they need to, but there are circumstances that we know of in the history of law enforcement and even in the history of St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department where officers did the right thing, but it was technically in violation of an aspect of the shooting policy.
So without going line by line,
Right.
we wouldn't have time to do that today, obviously. Would you say in a general sense that that this policy is clear and digestible for officers?
No.
It's not.
No.
Is it compared to other policies, by other police departments, is this very difficult to understand, or?
The restrictions part, particularly the issue with the preface that says that it's okay to violate these restrictions sometimes, I think could be cleared up with language that, for example, warning shots. Warning shots are generally prohibited. What that says is, look, people, we don't want you firing warning shots. We don't want you firing warning shots except for very narrow circumstances. So then what you do is you train on the policy. Because just giving someone a policy doesn't mean anything. You have to train people on what the policy is, whether it's law enforcement or anything else. So you train officers and you say, look, regarding point 5, warning shots are generally prohibited. Here's why. It is our philosophy in St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department that warning shots are generally a poor idea because we live in an urban environment, because as the subcommittee member pointed out, you shoot a round in the air, it's going to stop somewhere. So we teach officers, we don't want you shooting warning shots most of the time, but we understand there are times when it might be necessary. And here's what we want you to think about if you're going to try to do that. You have to think about your background, you have to think about where that round's going to go, so on and so forth.
Any other questions?
So, it sounds like this needs to be a little clearer for our officers to be able to be guided by it in a clear manner. Without going again line by line, so it sounds like the recommendation would be to clean up some,
Right.
Some of this,
Right.
For the sake of training our line officers
Right.
to be able to abide by it. Is there another sort of more overarching recommendation that you would like to make, or reaction in a more general sense to the policy as a whole?
No, I think the key issue, the goal of the policy is to give officers the best guidance that they can get about the moment. And when I say the moment, I mean when you're in a potentially dangerous situation. And so cleaning the language up is important. The other thing that, in my opinion, is so important is the review. And if in fact the police department is investigating the officer-involved shootings in the manner laid out with the Force Investigation Unit, and I have every reason to believe they are, and if in fact this tactical review is operating as it is intended, then the police department has moved forward, and that's good. But what we want is we want to think about the process almost as a circle. So we have an event, and we know we're going to have other events. We do the post-event review to inform how to do better in the next event. And if the policy is clear, and if the review is sound, in terms of the investigation is sound, and the tactical review is thorough, then you will get that circular feedback loop of learning. But without knowing how the tactical review is going, I can't say. So for example, you look at the membership of the Tactical Review Board, I don't know who these people are, I don't know what their level of expertise is. Unfortunately, typically in organizations, as you move up the chain of command, you get decoupled from the baseline knowledge about how to do the job. And so I don't know if the people who are part of the Tactical Review Board are people who possess the requisite tactical expertise. And so that's something that is amenable to a review to see how it operates.
All right, so we are running out of time. You have to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do we feel like we need to invite him back to continue the questioning? I know a few aldermen did not get a chance to ask. Well, we'll discuss.
I say, I don't have questions, but,
Well,
I
we
mean,
have
is it
to
all
wrap
right
this
with
one
you?
up.
I can't promise that I can always show up with the short notice that I've had but I'm always willing to come back.
Well, I'll tell you, it was helpful to get a copy of your marked up copy.
Mhm.
And so even if we don't verbally hear your comments, you've made a lot of written comments in here. And we'll discuss if we need to invite you back maybe next week or something. But again, thank you for your time. And this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much, sir.